Hello everyone, we are start learning chapter 3 and we are usually called the visualization. So basically after we understand the different data type and you are building a foundation and you know the name of each kind of data, you know the scale of measurement. Now the question is, when you're getting any kind of raw data, what is the first step? As you're exploring the data, right? So it is related to our descriptive statistics. And so basically we are trying to use the statistical method we're going to learn in this chapter to summarizing the data. And then for this chapter, we are looking at some beautiful chart and the fancy tables. And so before we creating the chart and the table, and our business owner or business decision maker or even yourself usually won't be able to get any business insight. And choosing the proper data visualization allow you to review a lot of interesting information from the data. So therefore, in this chapter, we are going to look at different chart and the table, and we're going to focus on using Excel to learn how to creating those tables and the charts. And so keep in mind, as you're watching the lecture video in this chapter, it is very important that when we move on to the Excel portion, you will follow the Excel to practice in order to assure you are able to developing the same chart and the table for your assignment and also for your future exams. So the Excel is very detail oriented. Sometimes because you forget about the little box you didn't check, and your result will be totally different, right? So therefore, it is very important that you follow the lecture video and to practice. And any example I walk through the Excel, and I also supply you with the Excel file, so you should be able to practice along with my video. Okay, so to make you a little understanding what we were going to see in this chapter, and I already including this business video in the beginning of this learning module, and you'll be able to find called LO1 inside of 423 million per year ugly toy queries. Okay, so here I'm just have a screenshot from that video, and so this is the illustration of one of the data visualization you're going to learn in this week. In this chapter, the key here is that before we are having this chart created, everything we saw just raw data. However, after we chose the proper visualization, it allows anybody with a minimum amount of the statistic background are able to understand. So for instance, this diagram, it's indicating the dramatic increase revenue from this kind of new toy, LO1, right? Compare 1 year, so it's increased by 40 times, right? 80 times. Okay, 80 times of the revenues. It's a huge increase, right? So at this point, before you're learning this class, you might not know how we are actually able to generate this chart. So one of the very important goals for this class is that after you're learning, you are able to developing this kind of visualization to help people who don't have a strong statistics background to read the diagram, and also you will play a role to help them to getting the insight from this kind of diagram. So before we dive into each of the visualization methods, and I want to give you some high-level information about how you are able to learn this part well, right? So when you look at the data and visualize how they were collected and measured, so it is very important that the first using your eyes to judge if the data, what kind of visualization will be proper. And so as we're learning this class, you will notice that the certain visualization can only be used to certain kind of data set. So therefore, you need to understand the guardrail of each method. And now I want to give you a general understanding about descriptive statistic. So we mentioned in the last chapter that statistics have two different kinds, inferential and descriptive statistic. And so in this chapter and also chapter 4, we are focusing on the descriptive statistics. So for the descriptive statistics, we have two different kinds. One is called the visual or graphical. So it really depends on who you talk to. Sometimes people just call it data visualization, and some people just call it the graphical display. Okay, as we look at the data visualization, that is what we're going to focus on chapter 3. It includes two general types. One is charts, the other is graph. Chart or graph, or including the tables. So they are provide insight into the characteristics of the data set without using mathematics. So it will be either table or charts or graphs. Okay. And so that is called a data visualization. And in our next chapter, we're going to focus on some numbers, such as a mean, median, mode. So you might already heard those terms from your high school. And so for those, we consider as called a numerical statistic. Okay, numerical statistics. And so they will provide insight into characteristics of the data set using mathematics. Okay, so what I want to see is that if your audience tend to be less educated in statistics, we tend to use visualization. Okay, visualization like a chart and table. Just think about the graph I just shown you. So that is coming from a news report, right? So as you know, everybody gonna read the news regardless their education level. So therefore, considering that, they prefer to use chart or graph. And so if your target audience are more like analysts, statistician, and so they all have some kind of statistic knowledge. And so in that situation, providing the numerical description will be more helpful along with your graph because it's adding more rigor of your analysis. Okay. Like I said, in this chapter, we explain several basic types of the chart and the tables and offer guideline on when to use them, advise you how to make them effective, and warn the way that the charts can be deceptive. Okay, so the most important thing for this chapter is first, know what the limitation of the chart, right? The guideline, when you need to use what kind of chart or tables. And the second is how you are able to develop in the chart, the table using Excel. And the lastly is need to be able to remember how to identify the chart, the deceptive chart, able to know how to prevent yourself creating those deceptive charts. Okay, so before we look at our first data visualization, and I want to give you this macro overarching view about what we're going to learn during this chapter. So it really depends on the data you have. So if you are dealing with a univariate quantitative data, just one variable, one column, so such as age, the number of years in school, so those are quantitative data, right? If you only had one column, so to creating the visualization statistic, in terms of tabular visualization, basically creating table, we're gonna learn frequency distribution, relative frequency, percent frequency, and cumulative frequency. But if you want to creating a chart, a diagram, and we're gonna learn histogram. Okay, so if the data, look at this column. So if your data is a category data, and only have one variable, and the table, if you want to developing a table to summarize the information about this data, you can use frequency, relative frequency, or percent frequency. But if you want to creating some kind of graph, then the method we're going to learn in this class including bar chart. So on the Excel, it also called a column chart. So the bar chart and the column chart are mean the same on the Excel. Or you can creating pie chart, or you can creating Pareto chart. Okay, Pareto chart. And then if you are dealing with the two quantitative data, so for instance, you have one column is GPA, the other column is SAT score. And if you want to use some kind of visualization to show the relationship between these two variables, and so the table way, creating a table, you're going to use cross tabulation or percent cross tabulation. So if you want to just creating some kind of graph instead of the table, and you are able to use a scatter plot. And so if the two variable, one of them, at least one of them are categorical. So for instance, one column is major, the other column is a GPA. So in that scenario, you are not able to use a scatter plot. So if you are thinking about create a table or tabular visualization, and you still can use a cross tabulation and percent cross tabulation. However, if you want to using some kind of graph in that scenario, you need to use either stack the bar chart or stack a column chart. Like I said, in the Excel, they call bar chart as column chart, or you also can creating the pivot chart. Okay, so in this class, we are learning all the item listed here. And as you read in the textbook, it also introducing like stem leaf display and a dot chart. I will not cover those two charts in this class. The main reason is they are rarely used in the business world. So everything I'm teaching you here are the ones that are frequently used in the business world. And as we went through each chart, make sure you know the scope of the chart, and also make sure you know how to use Excel to creating the correct chart. Okay, so now in our next video, we're going to focusing on is the frequency distribution development.